The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Cure.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said, when the owner of an estate wants a manager who can be trusted with all his goods, someone who will make sure the staff is cared for and fed, whom will he put in charge? A trusty and sensible supervisor. Congratulations to that person if he proves faithful and is hard at work when the owner comes home. In that case, the owner will give him a share of his property. But if the manager says to himself, the owner is taking a long time to come back, and he begins abusing his fellow workers and feasting and getting drunk, the owner may return unexpectedly. Instead of receiving a reward, the manager will be cut off and will share the fate of the damned. Do you suppose that I am come here to bring peace? No, I have come to bring the sword of division. My message will divide father and son, mother and daughter, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Those who prefer their father or mother to me are not worthy of me, nor are those who prefer their sons and their daughters. Why can't you judge for yourself what is right? When you are headed for court with an opponent, try to settle the case on the way and make peace with him. Otherwise, he will call you before the judge, who may turn you over to the jailer. Then you will not get out until you have paid the very last penny. Gospel inspired by God. In order to get who Jesus is, we have to understand 5 things. We have to understand, firstly, this is a brilliant teacher, an extraordinary teacher. We have to understand, secondly, that he's dealing with ineffable matter, meaning matter which cannot be articulated. The experience of the divine is an inarticulatable experience, but any teacher has to try to wrestle with it. And Christ realizes as a great teacher that although his matter is ineffable, he has to say something about it. And rather than resort to philosophy or theology or science, he speaks in parables and metaphors and symbols and stories, because that is the nearest you can get to an experience. As soon as you try to put stuff into concepts or create theologies, you're several stages away from the experience. And so the real teacher stays as close to the experience as possible by dealing only in metaphors or parables or proverbs or stories. So that's the second thing you have to realize about him. Next thing you realize is that his message can be unpacked in many, many, many different ways. Often there's an intra-psychic dimension to what he's saying, something that can be only understood as happening within the psyche of the individual. Sometimes you can unpack it as an interpersonal story. It has to do with relationships between one and another. A third level of it is he's speaking at a sociological level. Many of his stories can be also unpacked at the level of how it impacts society. And fourthly, he's speaking at a mystical level. There's a deep, deep, deep level in which he's actually contacting soul to soul. So as you listen to any teaching of Jesus, we have to try to unpack it at all of these kinds of levels. Now, it's complicated by numbers 4 and 5 because he's the ultimate shock jock. If you're not shocked by the readings this morning, you haven't been paying attention to them. They're really, really shocking. And this is typical Jesus Christ. He's trying to startle his audience into wakefulness rather than listening to somebody just droning on and on and on and everybody is fast asleep in their pews. He's waking us up constantly. And the fifth thing you find about him is that he speaks constantly in paradox, apparently contradicting himself from sentence to sentence. And so, for instance, right today, he talks about, you think I've come to bring peace? Dream on. I came to bring the sword of division. And then the next statement, I want you to come to terms with your opponent while you're still on the way and make peace. And so he's the master, he's the shock jock, and he's the master of paradox. And so in order to understand the teaching of Christ, you have to engage him in all these 5 facets. So I want to try to engage those today as I try to unpack some of the teachings of today. And I'm just going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one I will call the manager. Secondly, the swordsman. Thirdly, the peacemaker. And then finally, I want to ask myself the question, who lives at home? Who lives at home? So those are the 4 points I make this morning. So the first one, the manager. This first parable he tells this morning, very simple parable. He says, once upon a time, there was a very rich man who had a big estate, and he had a manager who was in charge of his property. And the owner went away on a safari. And while he was away, the manager began to think, oh, maybe he's not going to come back for a long time. So he began to abuse his fellow servants and to dominate them and, eat and drink and be merry and totally disregard his duties. And Christ says, foolish man, how do you know your master is not going to come back unexpectedly? And if he comes back and he finds you feasting and drunk, you're going to be thrown out with the damned. But if he finds you at your task and you're doing your duties, he's going to share his property with you. So how do you unpack that kind of a teaching? So the most obvious way, the one that we were probably brought up with if you were brought up in the Christian tradition, was that the owner is God and the manager is the individual human being, and the estate that he's managing is his own life, and the fellow workers are people in your life, colleagues, family, whatever, and the unexpected return of the master is death, and then there's judgment. And if you've been found wanting, you're going to get the thumbs down. And if you did a good job, you get to get the thumbs up. So that's the kind of the normal way in which we try to unpack this story. It's the story of the individual soul. God is the owner. The individual person is the manager, and at death, we get a judgment. Now, there's a few other ways of unpacking it as well. So very possibly, Christ was using this parable as a sociological criticism of the religion of his time. And so in this understanding, God indeed is the owner, and the manager are the religious authorities of his time. And they're doing a terrible job of it. And the fellow workers who are being abused are the laity, the lay people of Israel, who are being dominated and domineered by a religious institution. And Christ is saying, when the manager is going to come back, he's going to find you guys wanting, because you're not preaching spirituality. You've traded just dogma and legalism for love and for compassion. So you could see that Christ was maybe using this as a sociological, message. Indeed, you could well say that if Christ were to come back at any stage of Christian history, he could have used the very same image. If you just traded, for instance, the high priest for the Pope, and you traded the curia for the Sanhedrin, and you traded the cardinals for the Sadducees, and you traded the bishops for the Pharisees, you'd have the very same message. Christ would be saying again that the religious leaders have been found wanting. They've been abusing the laity, the people whom they were meant to be feeding, and to whom they were meant to be preaching good news. All they gave them was dogma and legalism. So you could say that Christ could have used this sociologically for the people of our time and our religious tradition. Which brings me to the realization that I'm totally convinced that if you could actually see behind the spacesuit of any one person, whether they were a president or a pope or whatever they were, if you could really see behind the facade of the spacesuit, this incarnated vehicle that each one of us inhabits, and you could really see to the soul, I guarantee you there would be homeless men and harried mothers who would glisten and gleam and radiate at the level of soul in a way that many of the popes and many of the presidents never have. So we shouldn't be fooled by the appearances or even by the office. While it is important to respect the office, it's a mistake, to give that kind of veneration to the holder of the office. Very, very often, these people who get into positions of power are very young souls who are narcissistic to the core. And although they occupy offices in which it's important for us to honor the office, very often these people, they believe their own lies. It's almost like you take part in a Shakespearean play and you get the part of Macbeth and you're parading around as a king. And then the play is over and you go home. But you go home and you continue to act as if you're Macbeth in your own family. This is what so many of these people do, presidents and popes of various ages. So it's very important for us to realize, to try to see behind the spacesuit. And so when Christ says, those who have eyes to see, let them see, he's asking us, do not be fooled by appearances. You may find in the humblest of people, literally a homeless man or a busy just mother with little kids. You may see, if you could see through the spacesuit to who that person really is, might have a very, very old, wise soul. And you could see to a pope or a president, and they're shallow, very recent arrivals on the scene. So this is part of what Christ's message is saying. But there's another way of unpacking this manager thing as well. And for me, it's the one that makes most sense to me. So the owner is not God, and the manager is not a religious institution, a pope or a president or, Sanhedrin. The owner is actually the soul, the individual soul. And the manager is the ego. And it is the relationship with the soul and the ego that Christ is ultimately talking about. Every single one of us has a soul who is literally the owner of the self, the core identity. But most of us think that the soul is absent. We're not even aware that there is a soul. In fact, we've come to the stage where we actually think we own the property. The manager begins to think he is the owner. The ego begins to think it is the self. And that's when the danger really, really happens. And Christ is saying, this is the real danger here. The real danger is that the ego begins to operate as if it were indeed the soul, as if it were the entire owner of the psyche. And that's the real danger. When we get into that position, then we live our lives at a very materialistic kind of level, at a very egoic and narcissistic level. So the manager is not some religious authority. It's not a pope. It's not a high priest of some system or other. The manager is, the ego operating on behalf of the owner, which is the soul in you. That's the first point I'll make this morning. The second point then I want to call the swordsman. This is a very enigmatic statement of Christ. And in fact, as Lawrence was reading the second reading for us from the book of Micah, there's the same motif coming through. So I need to give you a little bit of context to the book of Micah. Micah was a prophet in Israel about the year 730 BC, at a time when the great Assyrian Empire was threatening. And in fact, in the year 721 BC, the Assyrian Empire came in and it overthrew the northern kingdom of Israel and deported 10 of the tribes who are never heard of again. So this is the period at which Micah is preaching this morning. And he's talking about the rampant corruption in the leadership of the time, the institutionalized injustice of the period just preceding this overthrow by the Assyrians. And so you can understand where he's coming from. It seemed like all of society had gone to hell in a handbasket. And particularly, injustice was being institutionalized. It wasn't just that individual people were doing individual acts of injustice to other individual people, but that the whole thing had been embedded in an economic model and a political system. Ring any bells with you? Anything like what's happening in our times? The same thing happens again and again and again. The institutionalization of injustice through economic models, political systems, military movements. So the words of Christ ring through and the words of Micah ring through again. But then Christ makes this extraordinary statement. You think I've come to bring peace? I came to bring the sword of division. And so I tell you, the father will be against son, and mother against daughter, and mother-in-law against daughter-in-law. Now, is this Christ advocating division? Not at all. He's pointing out the inevitability of what happens when somebody has the integrity of wanting to evolve spiritually. Because every single one of us is born into a family system, and every single one of us is born into a culture. And while we make these, what I've called preconception contracts with our family and with our culture, and while we have to honor those and realize that the traditions we've grown up in have given us a foundation, we also need to realize that these very traditions, the families in which we've grown up, and the cultures of which we are a part, they hold us back. They do not want to move onwards. Every family and every culture thinks they've arrived at the ultimate way of doing family or the ultimate way of doing society, and they want us to stop there. And Christ is saying, if you're dedicated to evolution, inevitably you will find yourself at variance with members of your family or members of your culture, because the culture wants to hold still. In fact, yesterday's avant-garde spirituality is tomorrow's dogmatic, stagnant religion. It's been said one time, no man can lead two revolutions. That the person who's trying to move us out of stagnation at one stage, as soon as they get into positions of power, they then stagnate themselves. And that is not spirit. Spirit is constantly moving. It never rests. Evolution goes on again and again and again. And so we need to take from our family and take from our culture what is of value, but we need to go beyond where the family has been and go beyond where the culture is. Otherwise, we're not being true to spirit. Now, there are two things that they try to hold us down at. They try to hold us with a kind of an identity that they've given to us, and they hold us to a mission that they have outlined for us. And we need to break beyond both of these things. Most of us get our identity, from our family of origin. By the age we're 7 or 8, we've learned our roles, we've learned our rules. By the time we get to 12 or 13, and we develop the ability to self-reflect, and to be able to critique the family values we came up with and the culture of which we are a part, at that stage, culture shuts us down. They don't want anybody growing beyond the age of 12 psychologically or spiritually. They want us to be law-abiding members of the society as it was, as we'd inherited, and pass that on to the next generations. And of course, we have to pass on what is the value of that, but realize that every culture is just era-specific. Every family is era-specific. We need to grow way beyond our families and grow way beyond our cultures constantly. And so Christ will ask very famously, in the very center of the Synoptic Gospels, there's a story of Christ on the road to Caesarea Philippi, where he's pondering his purpose and his identity. And he stops in the middle of the road, and he waits for the disciples to catch up with him. And they're arguing about which of them is going to get which kind of portfolio in his government when he becomes the king of Israel. And he says to them, "Who do people think that I am?" And they said, "Well, some people think you're John the Baptist come back to life. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're one of the Old Testament prophets." And so Christ is saying, okay, what's the cultural expectation of me? What identity is being foisted on me by the culture? He says, okay, I hear that. What about you guys? You've been with me. And then they give him their own version. So it's like he's looking for the identity the culture gives him is one thing, and the identity his friends give him is another thing. But the most important question is, who does he realize himself to be? Every single one of us finds ourselves in the same position. There is an identity that has been given you by your family. Have you totally accepted it? Or can you grow beyond that? There's an identity which is given you by your culture, either because of your skin color, or your educational level, or your socioeconomic status, or your gender, or your accent. For all of these reasons, have you accepted that? Does that become who you are? Or is there is a sense of self which is beyond that? This is what Christ is asking us to do. Every single one of us needs to have an identity which is bigger than the family's imposition of identity, or bigger than the culture's imposition of identity. Unless we realize that every single one of us is an eternal being, eternal soul that was never born and can never die. There was a time when the spacesuit was born, and there's a time when the spacesuit will die, but that is not my identity. That is merely a resource for incarnational mission. But culture and family constantly impose identities on us. And that's what Christ is talking about when he talks about creating division between father and son, mother and daughter, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. It's having the courage to outgrow the identity that family has imposed upon us and culture has imposed upon us. So when you look at himself, for instance, you look at how he lived out his mission, in spite of the expectations of all the people and all the groups in his life. So the political authorities had an agenda for Jesus. If only he paid his taxes and kept the Roman laws, and didn't make waves, the Romans would have had no problem with him. The religious leaders had an agenda for Jesus. If only he'd keep the 613 precepts of Torah and pay his temple tax on a regular basis, and not be working miracles on the Sabbath, they'd be dead happy to listen to him. But he rejected that. His family had an agenda for him. There's this extraordinary passage in Mark's Gospel in chapter 3, where in verse 21, when Jesus had begun his public ministry, we are told his family came to take him by force because they thought he had gone mad. They thought he'd flipped his lid, making a fool of the family. This nice Jewish carpenter boy now pretending to be a rabbi. They were incensed that he was destroying the family's reputation. And they come to where he's preaching inside in a house, and he refuses to see them. So they go back home and they bring Mammy and they say, "Mom, did you hear what he's doing? He's making a fool of the family. Talk sense to him." And they drag his mother along. And she can't get in because there's a big crowd in the house. So they send in a message that says, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside and they want to talk to you." And Christ says, "Who's my mother? And who's my brother and sisters?" My mother and my brothers and sisters are those who hear the word of God and keep it. But they came to take him by force. They thought he'd flipped his lid. The crowd wanted from him miracles and signs. They wanted to be entertained. Baseball hadn't been invented yet. They needed something to kind of while away the time. So that's what they wanted, miracles and signs. Feed us and do miracles and we'll all follow you. Even his own disciples had an agenda for him. They wanted him, to be a particular kind of Messiah in which they'd be ministers of government, one guy in charge of education, one guy in charge of agriculture, one guy in charge of foreign policy. That's what they wanted. And even Christ's ego had an agenda for him. And the last day of his life, literally, he says to the Father, if it be possible, let this chalice pass from me. But always he comes back to his own identity and his own purpose. And finally he says, no, not my will, but thine be done. So he's constantly, in spite of all of the cultural expectations and all of the kind of identities he's been given, he cleaves only to his true self and his true purpose. And that's what he means, I think, when he talks about, I have come to bring the sword of division, father against son, etc. Now, we continually have to outgrow the systems which grew us. While honoring them, we can't stay where they are. Because, as I said, today's avant-garde spirituality is tomorrow's stagnant, dogmatic religion. And when you look at the history of the human race, you see this again and again and again. I just want to take a few kind of little issues to demonstrate it. Take the issue, for instance, of slavery. Slavery wasn't abolished in this country until the middle of the 1800s. In the time of Christ, it was totally accepted. In fact, in the book of Exodus, I think about chapter 20 or 21, there is a kind of a teaching about the various forms of slavery. And so it's one thing if you have slaves who are not Jews or Hebrews, you can keep those in perpetuity. But if you have a slave who's a fellow Hebrew, here's the law. And you can check it out in the book of Exodus. Here's the law. If you have a slave who's a fellow Hebrew, you can only keep him for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, you have to release him. If he came to you unmarried, he has to leave you unmarried. If he came to you married, when you bought him or you owned him, when you got him, he was married, you had to release him and his wife when he goes. But if he came to you as a single man, here's the teaching, and you as the master give him a wife and he has kids, at the end of 7 years, he's free, but the master owns the wife and the kids. Literally. So that was the teaching, if there's a fellow Hebrew slave. You come to the time of Christ and the teaching of Paul, and Paul totally accepts slavery. There's one instance in which Paul baptizes an escaped slave called Titus. But he sends him back to his owner called Philemon with a note saying to him, treat him well, because although he's your slave, he's also your brother. He's a fellow Christian. So Paul totally accepted that your slavery was the order of the day. The Protestant churches in this country in the 1800s and 1900s used biblical texts to justify the slavery of the African American people in our midst. And they quoted Scripture, rightly. They quoted Scripture, and there's actually evidence there. The Scripture says, yes, you're allowed to have these black people as slaves. They're descendants of Ham. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And in a biblical passage, he says, Ham shall be a slave to his brothers. And Ham is the father of the African nations. So there's total justification for having African slaves. Pius IX, our beloved pontiff, in 1866, signed a declaration which said in part, it is neither against divine law nor natural law to own slaves, to trade slaves, or to have slaves. 1866. Now, the only thing I could say in mitigation was he wasn't yet infallible. He didn't become infallible until 1870. But that was his teaching, 1866. Not only is it not against divine law nor natural law to own slaves, to trade slaves, and to have slaves. So that's what I mean by moving beyond religion, moving beyond culture. We constantly have to move beyond the version of religion, the version of family, and the version of culture that we've inherited. While we build upon that, we have to move beyond it. In our own times, we've wrestled with the same kinds of issues. Let's say, for instance, take women's rights. Women didn't have the vote in this country until the early 1900s. Up until our own time, they're discriminated against in various jobs. Men will get much more for the same job than women will do for the same job. In many of the churches, still in the Catholic Church, women do not have the same rights as men. And they'll point back to biblical precedent again, just like they did with slavery, to justify why this is so. In our own times, there's the controversy about gay rights. And they'll point back again to biblical passages to justify all kinds of prejudices about people who are in love with somebody of the same sex and are faithful to it and demonstrating extraordinary fidelity to each other. But we're using biblical texts as well to justify why this is, an abomination. Just like it was an abomination for a woman to speak in church. According to Paul, a woman should do two things in church: cover her head and shut her mouth. Literally. You like Paul? Okay, George. Anybody like George? So Paul taught that if a woman had a question, so when the preacher is preaching and the woman has something she wanted to ask, she's not allowed to ask it. She has to go privately when Mass is ended and consult her husband and say, what did he mean when he said? She couldn't ask the question herself. She had to keep her mouth shut and her head covered. So again and again and again, you see biblical justification for all kinds of extraordinary, belief systems. So we have to go way beyond the religion we've inherited, the families we inherited, and the culture we inherited. Our identity and our sense of purpose has to go beyond that. So that's some of what I believe Christ is talking about this morning when he talks about the sword. He came to bring the sword of division between father and son, and mother and daughter. This brings me to the third point. The notion then of the peacemakers. So side by side with, I have come to bring the sword of division, he says, come to terms with your opponent while you are still on the road. Or else your opponent may hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the jailer, and you'll be thrown in prison, and you won't get out until you pay the very last penny. Now let me give you just some of the kind of the historical context to this. At the time of Christ, there wouldn't have been magistrates in every little town or every little village. So let's say Kathleen and myself had a dispute, and we're deciding to take this to litigation, and we're marching off to the courthouse. The journey might take us 2 or 3 days. So Kathleen gets a whole entourage supporting her, and I'm getting a whole bunch of workers supporting me, and we're walking along the road together, and we're arguing with each other as we go on the road. And it may be a 2 or 3 day journey. And very, very often what happened is we resolve the dispute on the way, and we don't have to go in front of the judge. We come to peace, and we come to terms with each other before we actually get to the courthouse, and there is no need for a court. Christ is saying that's what you need to do. Now, how do you unpack that again? Now, the most obvious unpacking again is somehow that, that the journey with your opponent is the journey of life. And there are people who annoy you and upset you, and Christ is saying, come to terms with those people before you die. The courthouse, in some sense, or the judge is God, and the courthouse is death, and the jailer is Satan, and you're not going to get out. Either you're going to be in purgatory for X number of years, or hell for all eternity. That's kind of the obvious meaning of it. But that's not what Christ means at all. It's a metaphysical and an intra-psychic unpacking. Christ is saying this: come to terms with your opponent while you're still on the road. The opponents in this dispute, again, are the ego and the soul. And Christ is saying, if you haven't effected a reconciliation during incarnation between these two aspects, your core essence, which is your soul, and your ego, which is merely the CEO of a particular state of consciousness, then when it comes to the end of your lifetime, you're going to be subjected to a life review. It's not a judge, and it's not Satan, a jailer and a judge. It is a life review that you do with yourself and your heavenly mentors, where you look back on your life and say, how well did I do? I came down to do X and Y. Did I manage that? And sometimes, I'll have done some of it, others I won't have done. And Christ is saying, you won't get out until you pay the last penny. He's not talking about a kind of an exacting God, who's a punitive, kind of a distant, demanding deity. He's talking about the soul's commitment to growth. And he's saying, the soul will never give up until it has learned to love unconditionally in all circumstances. So that's what it means. You won't get out until you pay the last penny. Until you're fully enlightened, the journey of the soul isn't finished. So you'll do it as often as you need. You'll reincarnate again and again and again until finally you've affected the ability to love in all kinds of circumstances. It doesn't matter what conditions you find yourself born into. Whether you're born into a body with a genius IQ or retarded. Whether you're born into an athletic body or crippled with cerebral palsy. Whether you're born into poverty or born into riches. Whether you're born into a kind of a family which is politically, very, very powerful, or somebody who's powerless. Can you love in that circumstance? If you're a slave girl in North Africa in the 1300s, can you love anywhere? If you're a bigwig, a professional politician in the United States of America in 2014, could you love anywhere? So we don't get out until we pay the last penny, in the sense only that the soul is totally committed to the perfection of enlightenment, of accepting nothing less than total love. That's what the life review is about, and that's what the prison sentence is about. It's not God. It has nothing got to do with God, sending us to hell or purgatory. So that, for me, is the meaning of the notion of the peacemaker. And then finally ask myself the question, who lives at home? So at the end of the very first parable, Christ says, when the owner comes home, when the owner comes back. So what is home, and who lives there? Home is literally God. There is nothing except God. I've said this to you so often. Nothing exists except God. Everything that exists in the phenomenological realms is God in drag. Only God is real, and only love lasts. But in the meantime, we put on the illusion of incarnation and the illusion of time and the illusion of separation. I'm no more separate from Mary Kate, than the sun ray is separate from God. We're not separate from God. We're not separate from each other, and we're not separate from nature. We're merely different articulations of the same God. It's God generating experiences by self-fracturing in some fashion. And so it's coming to that realization that home is God. Home is the heart of God. Home is the womb of God. That's where we've come from, and that's where we go back. So who peoples that place? It's not a question that there's a heaven where the good guys go, and there's a purgatory where suffering people go, and there's a hell where the damned go. And so, for instance, the Catholic notion of the communion of saints. Yesterday's feast was the Feast of All Saints, and there's a history to this. Initially, the word saints was applied to all the followers of Jesus. They called themselves the saints. So anybody who was a member of the Jesus movement was a saint. Now, Mormonism picked up on this, and they called themselves the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So everybody in the group is a saint. That was the first meaning of saint. Then at some stage, saint took on a much more restricted meaning. It meant those people who exhibited extraordinary levels of holiness and therefore were worthy of our admiration and emulation. So they became a kind of a discrete subgroup. And then the third stage was the Catholic Church created all kinds of legalisms to determine who really could become a canonized saint. And so there was a whole bunch of requirements. There was a devil's advocate to try to hold up the process, and you needed to perform 2 miracles at least, and then you could be officially called a saint. And at some stage, the calendar got so cluttered that they threw a whole bunch of saints out of the calendar. Yeah, including some very popular guys, like St. Patrick. St. Patrick is not a saint. According to the Roman canonized system, he's not a saint. Nor is St. Christopher. Christopher was debunked as well a few years ago because the calendar was cluttered. They had to make room for more modern kinds of saints. So that's kind of the notion of saint. The truth is that the saint is all of us. And so today's feast is the Feast of All Souls. Yesterday was the Feast of All Saints, the really special guys, the canonized ones. And today is the rest of us, the schlemiels and dragging our asses along, to go through life. But the truth is, every single one of us is a saint. Every single one of us is a bite-sized piece of God. So the Celtic calendar from which yesterday's feast is borrowed, we have 4 great festivals in the Celtic calendar. The first one is called the 1st of February, and in Gaelic it's called Imbolc. The second one is the 1st of May, and we call it Bealtaine. The third one is the 1st of August, and is called Lunasa. And the fourth one is the 1st of November, and is called Samhain. And it's from Samhain we get the feast of Halloween. And when I was a kid growing up in Ireland, and in the Celtic calendar, these were 4 days when there were thin places. In Gaelic we have a phrase, coiloit, which means a thin place, a place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, and you can see through to the other side, interdimensionally. And there are 4 dates in the Celtic calendar when there were thin times, and it was Imbolc, Bealtaine, Lunasa, and Samhain. And Samhain is Halloween. So you have to be really, really careful on these 4 dates, because there were portals opened up between the dimensions. And not everything that came through the portals was necessarily light and love. So you had to go very, very cautiously, in thin places and at thin times. So I remember, for instance, in Ireland during those 4 days, when I was a kid growing up in Ireland, if you wanted to curse your neighbour, in a farming community, what you did was you took eggs and you hid them under a haystack in your neighbour's farm, and as the eggs got bad, all the crops failed. And so you have to be really, really careful on these 4 festival days. We had, when I was a small kid, at one stage, there was a guy who delivered milk to us, and he had a little horse and cart, and he had a big churn of milk in the back, and a long ladle, and he'd come to the door of each house, put the ladle in, take out a pint of milk, and pour it into your jug. But the horse's bridle on the 1st of May would always be wearing apple blossom, because apple blossom was a kind of a protection against the fairies. And the fairies came through the portals on the 1st of May in big way. And the fairies could be tricksters. And so Halloween, in some senses, is a reenactment of the realization that we live in thin places, and there are thin times in our lives. There are even thin people in our lives. The thin people are the people who allow us, or kind of help us to see through the veil into the mystical. And so we all encounter thin people, we encounter thin places, and we encounter thin times. Places where portals, or individuals who are portals. A Christ figure is like a mobile portal. To meet Christ, was to encounter an interdimensional portal possibility. And so that's the invitation for us this morning. That today and yesterday is an invitation for every single one of us to come to the realization that we're all saints. We're all bite-sized pieces of God. We're all sun rays from the same source that cannot be separated. As I said to you a few weeks ago, hell cannot exist ontologically. It can only exist psychologically and sociologically. But ontologically speaking, we cannot be separated from God any more than you can separate a ray of sunshine from the sun itself. So that is who we are. So who lives at home? You live at home.